London, 1816. The city moved beneath a sky the color of pewter, its streets slick with the night's rain and restless with rumor. Horses clattered past in a blur of black hooves and silver harnesses, as if hurrying to witness the spectacle society could not stop whispering about, the marriage no one envied. In St. George's Church, 100 candles burned low, gilding the faces of those gathered in curiosity rather than blessing. They had come not for joy but for gossip, to see the penniless daughter of a fallen earl become the bride of a man whose heart, it was said, had died with his first wife. Lady Charlotte Harrow stood at the altar, a still figure in ivory silk, her hands trembling within her gloves. The lace at her throat was borrowed, the pearls on her veil were dull, and though the music swelled with beauty, it seemed to echo her own dread. Across from her stood the Marquis Edward Blackwell, tall, composed, and entirely unreadable. His dark hair caught the dim light like polished obsidian, but his eyes, a grey so cold they might have been forged from winter itself, never softened. When he spoke his vows, the words were precise, without a tremor of feeling. He looked not at her but through her, as though reciting a duty rather than a promise. Around them, the murmurs of the crowd fluttered like moths to flame. "Do you, Edward, take this woman to be your lawful wife?" the clergyman asked. "I do," he said quietly, without hesitation, without warmth. Charlotte's lips parted. Her answer came on a breath that trembled but did not break. "I do." The moment passed, sealed by gold and ceremony. The church bells rang, but the sound was hollow, echoing against the vaulted ceiling and vanishing into the drizzle outside. A woman in the pews whispered, "She's little more than a governess dressed as a bride," and someone laughed softly in agreement. Charlotte heard, though she did not flinch. She lifted her chin with a fragile dignity learned from years of polite invisibility. If this was to be her life, she would meet it standing tall. Outside, the wind caught her veil, tugging it loose as they stepped into the waiting carriage. Edward helped her in, his gloved hand barely brushing hers, a gesture of courtesy, nothing more. The horses lurched forward, and London blurred past, its lamps shimmering in puddles like fading stars. Neither spoke. The silence between them felt like glass, clear, fragile, ready to shatter. When they reached Blackwell Manor, the air itself seemed to withdraw. The house was vast and old, its walls heavy with the scent of dust and loss. Portraits watched from shadowed halls, the gaze of ancestors stern and expectant. The servants bowed as they entered, their eyes darting quickly away. A fire burned low in the drawing-room, its light touching the edges of faded drapery and forgotten instruments. It was a home without laughter, without music, without life. Charlotte followed her husband into the parlor, her footsteps echoing faintly behind his. He turned at last, and for the first time, she saw something flicker behind his calm, fatigue, perhaps, or a wound not yet healed. But when he spoke, his voice was steady, deliberate, as though he had rehearsed it long ago. "You will have your own chambers prepared at once," he said. "The east wing is quiet. I trust it will suit you." She hesitated, unsure if she should thank him or ask why. But before she could speak, he continued, his tone colder now, almost formal. "Lady Charlotte, there are matters we must be clear upon. This marriage was necessary. My family demanded it. Yours required salvation. Let us not pretend otherwise." She looked at him, her heart tightening. "I did not expect pretense, my lord." He inclined his head, expression unchanged. "Good. Then you understand. You will find comfort and respect here, but not affection. You will never be my real wife." The words struck with quiet precision, sharper than cruelty because they were spoken without malice. Charlotte's throat constricted, though she managed a nod. "As you wish, my lord." She turned before he could see the color drain from her face and climbed the grand staircase alone, the echo of his sentence following her like the toll of a bell. In her new chamber, she removed her veil before the mirror and saw a stranger reflected there, a woman draped in finery that did not belong to her, her eyes shining not with joy but disbelief. Outside, the rain had begun again, tapping lightly against the glass, and the world beyond seemed distant, unreachable. She thought of her father, the debts, the letters, the desperation that had led her here. This was survival, she told herself, nothing more. Yet as she pressed her palm against the cold window, she felt the faint tremor of something she could not name, neither regret nor hope, but the restless beginning of both. Days passed, each one draped in silence. The Marquis kept to his study or rode out at dawn, returning after dusk with no word spoken between them. Charlotte dined alone, her place at the long table a solitary island amid empty chairs. She began to notice the details of the house, the faint scent of lavender in the library, a woman's portrait covered in dust, a locked music room where, once, a melody must have lingered. The servant spoke softly of Lady Helena, the first Marchioness, the one whose laughter had filled these halls. Charlotte did not ask questions. The dead, she thought, had already claimed enough of this place. One evening, when the house was still, she heard footsteps outside her chamber door. For a heartbeat, she thought it might be him. But it was only the housekeeper, carrying a tray of tea and a single envelope sealed with black wax. Inside, she found a note in Edward's hand. "You are to attend the royal garden party next week. The ton expects our presence. No greeting. No signature. Only instruction." She folded the note carefully, as one might fold a wound. The following week, she arrived at the gardens of Carlton House beneath a sky of perfect blue. London's finest gathered there, silks gleaming, jewels catching sunlight like drops of fire. The Prince Regent's laughter floated across the air, and gossip wound through the hedgerows like smoke. Charlotte walked a step behind her husband, her smile polite, her posture flawless. Yet everywhere she turned, eyes followed her, calculating, cruelly curious. She was the Marquis's new wife, the replacement, the necessity. Near the Rose Pavilion, the Duchess of Selborne paused in her conversation and offered a thin, gloved smile. "My dear Lady Blackwell," she said sweetly, "one could almost mistake you for her. The late Marchioness, I mean. But then, Helena possessed such spirit. You must find it a heavy mantle to wear." Charlotte curtsied. "The dead wear their mantles more easily than the living, Your Grace." Her voice was calm, her gaze unflinching. The Duchess blinked, momentarily silenced. Edward, standing beside her, looked down, whether in shame or surprise, she could not tell. When they returned home, the carriage was quiet but for the rhythm of hooves and the whisper of wind through the windows. Charlotte folded her hands in her lap, her chin lifted. For the first time, she felt not invisible but present, carved out of the same air that sought to erase her. And though her husband said nothing, his eyes flickered toward her once, briefly, uncertainly, as if noticing her for the very first time. In that fragile silence, something shifted, almost imperceptibly. The storm between them had not broken, but the air was beginning to change. Winter settled over Blackwell Manor like a silken shroud, soft and suffocating. Snow gathered along the window-panes, muting the world into stillness, yet inside the great house there was no warmth to match the fire's glow. Days passed in ritual silence, each moment measured and restrained. Lady Charlotte moved through the halls as if she were learning the language of ghosts, careful, patient, refusing to let despair devour her. She had ceased waiting for her husband's words. Instead, she began to find her own. One morning, she stood before the long-abandoned greenhouse at the edge of the gardens. The structure was half swallowed by ivy, its glass roof cracked, its air heavy with the scent of decay. The Marquis had allowed it to crumble after his first wife's death, a monument to memory and neglect. Charlotte, wrapped in her grey cloak, pressed her gloved hand against the frozen latch and entered. Inside, the air was sharp with cold, but beneath the frost she saw the outlines of life, the sleeping stems of roses, the withered vines waiting for sun. She lingered there a long while, as though listening to something only the silence could tell her. That evening, she penned a letter to Edward. Her handwriting was delicate but steady, her words precise. "My lord, I request permission to restore the greenhouse to its former order. It would be a small comfort in this long winter and a proper duty to the estate. With respect, Charlotte." She left it upon his desk without expectation. A week passed without reply. But one dawn, as the servants opened the shutters, Charlotte stepped out into the garden with pruning shears in hand. The frost stung her cheeks, and her breath rose in faint clouds as she began her work. She pruned, swept, mended, and cleared the glass one pane at a time. Her gloves tore, her fingers reddened. By the second day, Edward watched her from the library window. He did not move, only stood behind the glass, unreadable. He wondered, though he would not admit it, what compelled her persistence. When he finally spoke of it to the butler, his voice was curt. If she wishes to freeze among weeds, let her. Yet the next morning, when Charlotte reached the greenhouse, she found a crate of soil and a bundle of fresh tools waiting for her. There was no note, no acknowledgment, only silent consent. It was the first gesture between them not born of duty. Weeks later, London stirred with news of the Wexham Ball, a winter gathering hosted by one of Edward's oldest acquaintances. It would be Charlotte's first true appearance in society as Marchioness. The servants whispered that she should refuse, that it was unkind for a husband who scarcely looked at her to display her among those who mocked her. Yet Charlotte accepted without hesitation. If she must endure their judgment, she would do so beneath their light, not their pity. The evening of the ball arrived with flurries of snow and the scent of perfume and wax. Carlton House glittered like a world made of gold. Charlotte entered upon her husband's arm, the silk of her gown pale blue, the color of moonlit frost. Around her neck hung a sapphire pendant, heavy, exquisite, unmistakably old. It had been placed upon her dressing table earlier that evening by the Dowager Marchioness, Edward's mother, with the remark that a wife of Blackwell ought to wear what her betters have worn. When Charlotte stepped into the ballroom, conversation faltered. The pendant had once belonged to Lady Helena. Every gaze in the room seemed to rest upon the jewel, and then upon her. Whispers unfurled like ribbons through the crowd. Edward approached her across the floor, his face shadowed with something between anger and disbelief. "Do you know what you are wearing?" His voice was low, controlled. "I do," she replied evenly. "Your mother deemed it proper for a marchioness." His hand closed around hers, not in affection but restraint. "Remove it." "I cannot," she said softly. "To do so would insult her gift, and you." For a long moment he said nothing, and she saw conflict move through him like the flicker of light across water. Then he released her hand, turned sharply, and left her standing in the middle of the room. Charlotte's heart thudded, but she did not falter. Instead, she crossed to the edge of the ballroom, where the musicians played a slow waltz. A few women smiled, cruel, satisfied smiles. Yet one man approached her with courtesy untouched by mockery. He was a foreign envoy, Count Vescari, whose manner was elegant but kind. "My lady," he said in accented English, bowing slightly, "you wear sorrow as if it were made of silk. It becomes you, though I wish it did not." She allowed a faint smile. "Sorrow is a fashionable companion in London. I merely dress accordingly." They spoke briefly, politely. But those who wished for scandal needed little to create one. By morning, the Tun was aflame with whispers that the Marchioness had shared a secret conversation with the Count, that her eyes lingered too long. Edward read the papers at breakfast, his expression unreadable. When Charlotte entered, he folded them with care and rose. "You have made yourself a topic, my lady," he said. "I have done nothing shameful," she replied. "Rumor does not concern itself with truth." "Then let it concern itself with silence," she said quietly. "I will not defend myself against shadows." It was the first time her voice had met his without trembling. And though anger flickered in his gaze, something else lived beneath it, something like respect. That afternoon, when the Duchess of Selborne repeated the gossip in the presence of half the court, Edward interrupted her with a voice sharp as a blade. "My wife," he said clearly, "requires no defense. Her honor stands as firmly as this house's name." The room went still. Charlotte, standing beside him, heard the words echo in her mind. "My wife." For the first time, they sounded like truth. That night, she placed the sapphire pendant on his desk beside her letter from months before. On the back of the note, she wrote only, "I have no wish to wear another woman's ghost." Then she returned to the greenhouse, where the air was warmer now, faintly scented with new life. She tended the soil by candlelight, her gown hem damp with melted snow. When she looked up, she saw him standing in the doorway. He said nothing at first, only watched her with eyes that no longer seemed so distant. "You should not be out in this chill," he murmured finally. "I find it bracing," she said. And honest. He stepped closer, his breath a pale cloud in the dim air. You do not fear to speak your mind to me, Lady Charlotte. I fear many things, my lord, she answered, meeting his gaze. But silence no longer among them. For a heartbeat, they stood surrounded by the faint scent of roses and earth. Then he spoke her name, softly, almost as if testing it upon his tongue. Charlotte. The sound of it startled her more than any declaration could have. It was the first time he had said it aloud since their vows. And though no further word passed between them, something fragile shifted in the space that had once been cold and hollow. When he left, the candlelight trembled, catching upon the glass like the first glimmer of spring. The days that followed unfurled in a hush neither comfortable nor cold, but uncertain, as though the house itself held its breath. The air in Blackwell Manor had changed, softened in places once carved by silence. Servants noted that the Marquis no longer lingered in his study till dawn, that he walked the gardens more often than before, that his eyes followed his wife when she entered a room. Charlotte, for her part, neither sought his attention nor fled from it. She continued tending the greenhouse, the small world she had revived from ruin, though now she found fresh soil waiting before she arrived, or the tools polished, or a lantern already lit. She said nothing of these things, but she noticed. Spring came slow to the country that year, as if reluctant to believe in renewal. Snowdrops broke through the frost like whispered promises, and in their quiet persistence, Edward saw a reflection of her, unyielding, uncomplaining, and somehow still full of life. He began to visit the greenhouse himself, first out of curiosity, then from a strange need he would not name. There, among the growing things, his composure faltered. He asked her once, without looking at her, "Why do you spend your days in this solitude?" She smiled faintly, brushing soil from her gloves. "Because it listens better than people do." "And what does it tell you?" "That everything worth keeping must be tended," she said, and her tone, though gentle, carried meaning he could not ignore. That night he stood by the fire in his study, her words echoing through him. For years he had built his life upon restraint, believing it a virtue, a defense against grief. But now he wondered if restraint had not become another form of cowardice. The memory of his first wife, Helena, no longer felt like devotion. It felt like an anchor dragging him from the shore where life might begin again. The following morning, he found Charlotte reading in the library. "I have been invited to London," he said abruptly. "There are matters at court that require attendance." "Of course," she replied evenly. "Shall I accompany you?" His hesitation was brief, but it existed. "If you wish it." "I do." London in spring was a study in contrast. Muddy streets and blooming lilacs, gossip and grandeur, life and decay intertwined. At every turn, whispers of reform and scandal fluttered beneath the sound of carriage wheels. The Regent Circle was restless, its courtiers hungry for distraction. When the Blackwells arrived, curiosity followed them like a scent. At a dinner hosted by Lord Wexham, the Marquis's name stirred once again among the ambitious and the envious. A rumor had surfaced. Papers suggesting Edward had interfered with certain military contracts after the wars, using his influence for gain. It was false, yet dangerous, for such whispers could undo a man's standing in a single season. Charlotte heard it first, as women often did, in the powder room, where talk flowed like perfume. She said nothing, only lowered her gaze and withdrew, though her pulse thundered with dread. That evening, while Edward was summoned to speak privately with the regent's adviser, she sought the truth. Through quiet questions, she discovered the source. Lord Ashcombe, a rival of her husband's, had leaked forged documents to secure favor with the court. When Edward returned home, his expression was dark. "They will open an inquiry," he said. "Ashcombe has arranged it so that I must answer before the regent himself." "Then we must act before he does," Charlotte said, her voice steady. "There is nothing to be done. To refute a rumor is to dignify it." "Or to end it," she countered. "If we find the evidence, the lie will crumble." He looked at her then, not with irritation, but with astonishment. "You would involve yourself in this?" "I already am," she said. "What touches your name touches mine." For days she worked quietly, writing letters, sending trusted servants to confirm records, even appealing to the Dowager Marchioness for introductions long and used. When at last she discovered the ledgers that proved Ashcombe's deceit, she brought them to Edward herself. He stared down at the papers in silence, the flicker of candlelight trembling against his face. "How did you manage this?" he asked at length. "I listened," she said simply. "People speak freely to those they think insignificant." A long pause passed between them. Then, softly, he said, "I have underestimated you, Charlotte." "No," she answered, her voice low. "You have simply not tried to see me." The inquiry that followed was brief. Edward presented the evidence before the regent with calm precision. Ashcombe's influence evaporated within hours. His name was struck from the lists of favor. When the Marquis returned home that night, he found Charlotte waiting in the library, a book unopened in her hands. "It is done," he said quietly. "I am glad," she replied. He stepped closer, and for once his composure faltered entirely. "You have given me back more than reputation," he said. "You have given me reason." Her gaze lifted to meet his, uncertain but unafraid. "Reason for what?" "To live," he whispered, "and to hope again." He reached for her hand, not with command but reverence, as though afraid she might vanish if he held her too tightly. For a moment she did not move, then slowly, deliberately, she let her fingers entwine with his. The touch was simple, almost chaste, yet it carried the weight of everything unspoken between them. That night, the manor's windows burned bright against the dark. The world beyond remained full of whispers, but inside, the silence was no longer cold. It was warm, alive, waiting. In the days that followed, they grew accustomed to each other's nearness. He began to read aloud by the fire in the evenings. She laughed more freely. The servants smiled quietly in corridors, aware that something long dormant had begun to breathe again. But peace is fragile, and love, when newly found, walks a narrow path. Word came from London once more, of Helena's brother, returned from abroad, demanding that Edward surrender certain family heirlooms he claimed by bloodright. Among them was the sapphire pendant Charlotte had returned. The demand reopened wounds Edward had thought healed. He rode to London at once, leaving without farewell, consumed by duty and memory. Days passed without message. Charlotte, fearing the worst, traveled after him, unchaperoned and against all custom. When she reached his townhouse, she found him alone in the study, the pendant in his hand, his face pale with exhaustion. "She wanted this buried with her," he said hoarsely. "I could not. I told myself it was love, but it was guilt that bound me to her." Charlotte stepped forward, her voice trembling. "Then let it end tonight. Let her rest, and let the living begin to live." He turned toward her, eyes raw with something between sorrow and salvation. "And you?" he asked. "Would you truly have me, knowing the man I have been?" "I married the man you are," she said. "I only waited for him to remember it." He drew a slow breath, then crossed the distance between them. The pendant slipped from his grasp, landing softly upon the carpet. His hand rose to her cheek, tentative, reverent. "You will never be my real wife," he whispered, not in rejection now, but in awe. "For you are far more. You are my salvation." Outside, London's bells marked the turning hour.